listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Hey, Housers. Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite, and I work with an amazing group of people at Blue Door, the organization responsible for this podcast. Check us out at bluedoor.ca. We do all sorts of things around supportive and affordable housing, emergency shelter, as well our construction social enterprise that we're looking to grow. If you were thinking that you might want to do some type of pre-apprenticeship program with high impact that can pull people out of poverty and put them into the trades, our construct program is looking to expand. We don't want to run it. We want you to run it, but we'll help you set it up so we can have maximum impact. Just reach out at bluedoor.ca. Of course, listen, if you have ideas on podcasts or you have questions or anything or comments around the podcast, reach out to me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca. I'd be happy to chat with you and would love to hear your ideas. Many of these pods come because people have reached out and said, you should talk to so-and-so who's doing great work, or this person who's a lived expert who's written a book, or who, anything like that. I would love to have your ideas. Today we're going to talk about government relations on the podcast. I think so many nonprofits are doing incredible and impactful work across the country, around the world. We do this, and sometimes there's that disconnect between nonprofits and government. Government also, I think, quite often, and I mentioned this on this podcast, we think that government has all the answers. They should do something about housing. They should do something about poverty. And they absolutely should, but they may not know how, or what's the best use of dollars, and how do we shape policy that is really going to be impactful and effective, right? And I think that's the work of so many people that work in government relations, and even in our sector as well. I think we often think nonprofit, that we can't afford to take on as a luxury to have people doing the government relations work. And although it's an added expense, as I think one of our pod participants talks about, guest talks about, that you really can't afford not to. Really, the payback to that of potential dollars and connections and policy change that will help shape your work is well worth it. So today I reached out to three experts in the area. We have Jacob Gorenkoff, who's the CEO and founder of Homeward Public Affairs. And we have Danya Vered, who's the Vice President of Government Relations at Strategy Corps, and Maggie Rodrigues, who's the Government Relations Lead at CAEH. And the three of them are wonderful. We talk about why it's important to nonprofits to engage in government relations, why it's possible to have the ear of government. We talk about the changing dynamics right now in government over the next year, all these different changes that are going to happen. How can we prepare? And we talk about one of their wins as well, some of the wins, and they talk about why it's great to have those kind of front page wins, those smaller wins, when you see stuff you've worked on so hard kind of move forward. It's a great conversation, and I think really, really important, and in the sector right now. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Let's go to that conversation. Jake, Danya, Maggie, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of On the Way Home. So happy to have you here.
Thanks
so the
so much
first
for having
question.
me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Danya, for that. I know it doesn't seem like Jacob and Maggie are that thrilled about being here, I guess. They're stunned silence. I don't know what's happening. Well, we'll see if they can make their way back through the questions. But thank you, Danya, for that. Okay, so we always begin this podcast with the same question because it's a little different for everyone. It's really personal, and that is, what does home mean to you? Danya, we're going to start with you, then we'll go to Maggie and Jacob, because you've been on a couple times, so I'm going to see if you get it right this time. So you'll go last. Go ahead, Danya.
Thanks. I didn't quite, it took a long time to think about this. But to me, I think home is about supports. You can have a bed or a roof over your head in many places, but that feeling of security and belonging from having a home, I think, comes from knowing that you have support around you. And that support could be from family or friends, or from, the community that you build around you. It could also be supports, like mental health or rent or skills building or things like that. But really, those supports are what ground you to a place and time, and I think give you comfort and security.
Mm-hmm. I think I can jump in here, and I think that when I'm thinking about home, there's a couple of things that I think about. So I think about the housing element of it first. So like the elements of safety, affordability, that your housing is adequate. So I'm thinking about if you're a family, like your house serves what your family needs, and that you can afford it, you can pay for it, and then it's something at the end of the day. And then I also think about the community element of home. And so like when I first moved to Ottawa 10 years ago, I really felt disconnected from the city, and it didn't feel like home for a long time until I built a community here. And so I think that community element of home is really important to me, in addition to like what that house actually looks like for you.
Maggie, it's such a good point, and we often say that when we're housing people, right? It's not just about housing; it's about community. To your point, because we put people. Sometimes what we used to do is we take people from a shelter system and put them into housing, and not build the community around them. We'd stop there, and then they'd end up back in the shelter system because they didn't build community. In the shelter, they actually had a sense of community. They had friends and people who cared, and then we put them on their own, and they didn't have that. So now we've learned, hopefully, from that, and to Danya's point, in a sense, that we have those supports, right, that help them kind of embrace the community, get involved, so the housing sticks moving forward. Jacob, what are your thoughts? What does home mean to you?
Yeah, I think, generally speaking, with the kind of work that, Maggie, Danya, and I do, we hear a lot about homes as in, creating new housing units. But we also know, and I personally know, that home is more than that. It's more than four walls and a roof. It's also about community, like, we've been saying. It's about being connected to your people and to your surroundings. And I think also in light of the affordability crisis people are feeling, it's also about affordability, right? Can you afford to live where you are? Because if you're not feeling like you can afford to live where you are, you can't really feel like you're getting that connectedness to your community because you're just struggling to make ends meet. And I think that's something that's especially true for people that are of lower incomes who are really feeling the affordability crunch right now.
Yeah, well said. Well said, all of you. I mean, it's interesting. I was complaining last week. I had to take a short trip to Ottawa, and I don't like to travel much anymore. And so I used to love it when I was younger, and I'd be like, yes, you'd go out, and it was kind of adventurous. And I mean, unless I'm going somewhere cool, but and no offense to Jake and
Offense
Maggie,
taken, it's okay.
Ottawa, come on. But I went, and I'm like, and I think it really is just around comfort, right? Like it's around that comfort, and like you get back home, you shut your door, and there's that sense of relief, right? And so many Canadians don't have that comfort and are not feeling that relief. Today we want to talk about government relations, and before people sign off here, this is a very exciting topic in a sense because it's very, very important to our sector. The government relations piece. Most nonprofits. I teach intro into the nonprofit sector course, and we spend some time on this, just talking about like if we look just strictly at funding, right? So many nonprofits are funded anywhere from 70 to 100% through government, and they're looking for an advocacy. Agencies are looking for change. It starts with government policy and that kind of thing. So it's very, very important. Yet we really don't put enough into it. So we want to talk a little bit more about that, and that's my question to you: is why is government relations so important to the nonprofit sector, and what role does it play? Maggie, we're going to start with you. We'll go to Jake and then Danya.
Perfect. Yeah. Couldn't agree more that nonprofits are kind of, I think you said off the top, like they're doing it off the side of their desk, but it's so important in seeing the wins that we want. And I feel really strongly about using government relations for good. And I've seen firsthand how that's possible through effective government relations and advocacy and policy and communications campaigns kind of work, and how we're able to make change through our sector. And I've seen what kinds of government investments and policies have been implemented directly through the work of nonprofits to advocate for their work. So I think that the halls of like Parliament Hill, of provincial legislatures, of City Hall are being dominated by people who are trying to have their voices heard, and nonprofits need to be a part of that because they're doing good work to change our community. So I think that people who are particularly advocating for things that are making our communities better places deserve to be heard in all of our halls of power. And I'm excited to see, well, I think maybe I live in this like bubble where I see this happening all the time, and I'm excited to see that happen a lot more.
Yeah. So I think of it like this, kind of similarly to Maggie. Our governments create a lot of the rules or parameters by which we structure the way that we live and work. So government relations is how we as organizations can engage with those rules so that we can shape them to benefit the missions that we're pursuing. So, Mike, like you said, Maggie, like you said, a lot of nonprofits and charities are doing this off the side of their desk, or they're not doing it at all. And I know from my experience in a previous job as a nonprofit executive, um, it's really hard to think of taking on any more than you're already doing because you're already doing a lot of work. And the thing that I would emphasize is that government relations truly is critical in that work, and so it's important to take that on in a more fulsome capacity. So think of it almost like a bridge between your mission and the policies that are shaping the way that you are able to pursue that mission. Some of which might even be stifling you in your ability to pursue what you want to pursue or need to pursue for the people that you're trying to support. So by proactively engaging with government, nonprofits and charities, social enterprises can align their solutions and what they're pursuing with government priorities so that they can amplify their voice and unlock the resources to do their work.
The danger of going third on a big question like this. You guys made really great points. I would just come back to the important recognition that nonprofits and government have a special relationship, right? They're interdependent. Governments rely on the nonprofit sector to provide services to Canadians and fill gaps that government can't, reach all the time. And nonprofits rely on government to provide funding and to develop good policy and regulation and legislation that give the nonprofits the space to provide the best services they can and to have the best impact for the people in their community. But as you say, nonprofits have limited resources and are often doing this off the side of their desk. But an investment in government relations can actually help to position nonprofits to focus actually more on their core work and expand impact with the right policy regulations or funding. And so, for nonprofits, government relations can help you understand how governments make decisions and why governments make decisions, which can help you reposition your business and your program objectives. And also, quite honestly, help navigate the tricky federated system that we have and the impacts of intergovernmental relations and broader political trends. Because you may think that a government in one order of government is making a decision because of X, but in point of fact, it's in reaction to something that another order of government is doing. And if you can play an interlocutor role there so that the orders of government can understand what the impact is of those individual changes on your operations, on your ability to have impact, it can really sway decision makers' minds. And a lot of this is education in that respect.
I like what you all were saying there. I think it is tricky, and it's trickier than people think, right? I think often nonprofits, I sent an email and no one got back to me, and you know, um, I think to navigate, you are system navigators in a sense, right? To making different things happen, and government does play a huge role, especially when it comes to what we focus on in this podcast, housing. Right, housing is on everyone's minds these days, and I'd like to think, all three of you, everyone's on this pod has played a part in that, right? When you say housing is a few years back, groups coming together and kind of pushing housing, that mandate to government to make it top of mind really worked, right? Groups like the CHRA and others. And now it is. Day in, day out, right? You can't read any kind of news without talking about the housing crisis or prices up and down, or just even an affordability crisis. How does the work you do in government relations help to navigate solutions? So we're going to start with Jake this time, then go to Danya, and then Maggie.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So first, what I would say is just in relation to what I'm working on right now. I launched my company, Homeward Public Affairs, in January 2024, specifically to work with nonprofits and charities to tackle Canada's housing issues. And it's something that is incredibly central to what we do, hence the name Homeward, and it's something that I see as both really important to myself personally and professionally. So There's no question at all. Housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable, whether you're looking to rent or own, whether you're looking at market or non-market options. So we've been working with some really great organizations, Blue Door included, around multiple different areas, with the goal of really trying to attack the problem from multiple angles. So we've been working with a couple different national organizations to influence federal policies and programs designed to create new units to maintain affordability and do other things that are related to that. We've also more recently been engaging with the government of Ontario around trying to create a capital funding program so that there is stable, accessible resources to create the affordable housing that the province needs. We've also been, working with, yourselves and our friends at Loft Community Services around trying to source funding for specific housing projects that will create really important developments in key communities. We've also been working, again, with yourselves at Blue Door and our friend Faisal at the Labor Education Center around, training the workforce that we actually need to build the housing that we need. Because right now we're in a situation where we not only don't have enough housing, but we don't have enough workers to build the housing. We've also been, trying to support innovation in the housing space, working with, really innovative organizations like one called One Bowl Housing Corporation that's revolutionizing the way that we approach the housing supply chain to essentially create and pitch pilot projects to government that they can fund so that we can start scaling up new solutions. And we've also been working with different Indigenous communities towards different economic opportunities and pursuing the scale up of innovative construction technologies with the housing needs in their communities, whether they're living in their nations or away from them. So all that to say, we're working with organizations with the express intent of tackling the housing crisis from multiple angles, and that's something that we want to continue to support in an increasing capacity.
Yeah, and housing is certainly top of mind for everyone, and there are multiple avenues to tackle the housing challenges, both from a housing stock perspective, but also in terms of housing and homelessness and the prevention of homelessness, and what that means for different subpopulations as well. Whether that's Indigenous or youth as examples. And there's a lot of policy the government's developing at any given time, and it's important for them to get it right. And that requires, hearing from the people who are not necessarily the loudest in the room, but are doing tremendous work on the ground that's moving the needle and may not necessarily feel as comfortable talking to government because either they're focusing on their core business or in the provision of services, or they're Indigenous communities that have, a very complicated relationship with the Crown. I work with my clients to make sure that their voices are heard in ways that they feel are most comfortable. And again, that's particularly important for Indigenous partners. A lot of my work involves educating government and opening their perspectives beyond what seems obvious to ensure that policies and programs can increase their impact, right? So, a visit to a client's frontline service organization can help a minister or a member of parliament understand the experience of their constituents in accessing services and then become a champion for finding additional funding. Or very significantly, a working session with a group of Indigenous partners, Indigenous housing providers, like I had recently, can highlight how a new government funding mechanism that's under development might actually be developed in a way that excludes Indigenous organizations, just because of the way that things are traditionally developed. And so that might prompt a rethink of the program design in order to be more inclusive. And I've had the pleasure of working with a number of organizations focused on, youth homelessness and youth homelessness prevention in particular, like Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Covenant House Toronto, where they are looking to practical solutions to really center the experience of youth. Because traditionally, when you think of someone who is unhoused, you think of and policies developed for older single men. And so, how do you help governments design programs that center what it means to be a youth when you are at risk or near risk of homelessness, and what are the measures you can put in place, again, that focus on youth, to ensure that they are diverted from that path towards chronic homelessness. So, I really work to help organizations articulate their good ideas for government, and particularly like foundational policy pieces that can unlock funding in a non-traditional way, and then shepherd it through the right people within government.
I'm excited to talk to you after this, Danya, about the youth homelessness piece. That's awesome to hear a lot of that work that you're doing. But you're right that housing is on everyone's mind right now. And I think that, like, I'm thinking about two things. So it's on everyone's mind because it's affecting more people personally. Like, more people are feeling the way that rent and housing costs are affecting them in their own lives. But housing is also front and center because the public is talking about it and they're putting it on the political agenda. Like, all of us talking about housing and the public rallying around the need for more affordable housing is forcing politicians to kind of compete for the best solution to solving the housing crisis, which is a good position to be in. So when I think about my government relations work around housing, I'm thinking about a few key things that I'm focused on right now. So there's the policy work, and I agree on the education piece and the role that our sector has to play in educating, but also just putting forward good policy on housing in an environment where people are willing to take it up. But then going back to the public pressure piece, I'm thinking a lot about campaigns and how we can rally the public to put pressure on their politicians, and how can we get more people talking about housing and homelessness going into the next elections, either provincial or federally, and getting them to talk about the solutions that are sector driven. And then the last thing I'm thinking about is in housing right now, there's just so many people on the ground who are doing really good work, who have really good experience. And how do we build up their government relations and advocacy skill set to be able to do that work on their own? And so I'm really interested in the homelessness space of how we can empower communities and organizations to do that government relations work and tell their stories and use that for impact. So I'm really excited about the way that housing and homelessness is on the political agenda right now, and how can we use this moment in time to deliver the policy solutions we need and get the public to really rally around this issue and put pressure on their politicians.
No, thanks for that. All great answers. And Maggie, what you're saying there about rallying the public too. I mean, nothing moves government quicker than the thought of losing votes, right? I mean, and when you put that kind of public pressure, as we've seen, and CAH has done quite a few different kind of rallies around. And I remember when I think Barrie last year, when they were going to fine people, I think, for giving out water and food to people experiencing homelessness, and there's an outcry, and CAH did, and you make it really easy too. You did this big poll, like, right, hey, send a letter to your, and it worked. I mean, that and other advocacy, but you were really good at bringing groups together to push that, and ultimately the council came to their senses and stepped back. I think quite often nonprofits think, or I think just the public in general, right, think and expect government to have all the solutions as well, right? We have a homelessness crisis, do something, so figure it out. And they, honestly, they don't. And so you all act as connectors to people that do have some of those solutions. Let's talk about, like, I mean, you've touched on this, but let's dive a little deeper. How important is it for nonprofits to have the ear of government, and why? Because I think a lot of them are like, look, I'm just focused day to day. I'm running these programs. I don't have time for this. Why should I care? And that's kind of the question we're asking there. This time, Maggie, we're going to start with you, and go to Danya, and then end with Jake.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about in the last question about, well, I'm thinking about this moment in time of governments being willing to take up solutions, or there's this pressure that's building for them to respond. And so nonprofits having the ear of the government is really important to give them the solutions that we need. I'm really interested in how we can have sector-driven solutions that are informing government policy. I think so much of what we saw in the housing plan that was released in, I think, April of this year was driven by sector solutions. And it's I think we're actually in a unique moment where it's not all the time where governments are really talking in the weeds about housing policy, but for them to understand what that looks like and to be talking about it in a way that the sector has been talking about it as well, I think it is because the nonprofits and housing organizations have been able to get the ear of the government. And so I think it's about how we can get solutions fed into the government and working with them. I think like Danya had said about kind of the unintended consequences of some policies and how we can work with governments directly to shape and build programs and policies that work for the housing sector. I think later in the conversation we'll talk about some of our government relations work in the past, but I think that's been some of my work as well, is how do we shape programs to actually work and kind of divert some of the unintended consequences of government policy by helping government to understand how the sector works.
Yeah, and like I said before, there's an interdependent relationship between governments and nonprofits, and there is a role for nonprofits to play. And not every nonprofit is aligned, not every state, partner within the sector is aligned on the solutions, and it's important to be able to identify who is the right person at the right place and time to put forward your great idea or your coalition's great idea in order to really advance your vision of what the potential for the sector can be. Nonprofits are regulated by government just like every other organization, and if you want that regulation or that program or policy to unlock potential for you, it's critical that you identify who it's best to talk to and what that, as Maggie said, what that great idea is within the sector to advance. If you're an organization that has been around for decades and is having tremendous, success advancing impact on the ground, and you want government to focus on funding established and existing infrastructure, then it's critical for you to be there to say, hey, you don't always have to create something new. Leverage the infrastructure that already exists so you can quickly get dollars, or services to the people who need it immediately. And these nonprofits, they're on the ground, right? You have vital insights to provide that can really I keep saying this, but unlock potential funding sources for you. And if you're not the one there speaking up, programs may be designed in a way that might accidentally or purposely exclude you. And it's important to be able to say, I've done all that I can to ensure that my organization, my core business, and my sector are top of mind for a minister or a member of parliament or member of provincial parliament, in order to feel like you're able to complement the impact that you have on the ground with the right policies and regulation to amplify impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Danya and Maggie, you both made really amazing points. I'm really I feel very fortunate that I get to share some time with you guys today. I think when I think about this question, what I would really say to encapsulate my thoughts are that it's very important that nonprofits in the housing space engage in government relations, because it's important for the sustainability and longevity of the sector. And I say that in the context of having had to learn a lot about housing policy over the last several decades. And a lot of nonprofit housing leaders will remember the decades before the national housing strategy, between the 90s and up till the mid 2010s, when there were very minimal resources to create affordable housing. And though the national housing strategy isn't perfect by any means, imagine if the affordable housing sector had no connection to government to unlock the resources needed so that we can build all the housing that we need, right? Government controls the policy levers that shape how we solve the housing crisis. That's something that's particularly true for non-market housing, because as we all know, non-market housing typically needs some form of subsidy to ensure that rents are below market rates. And so, like we've all been saying, housing, like nonprofit housing leaders, are incredibly knowledgeable a lot of the time. I think about our friend Ray Sullivan at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, who I had the privilege of working with and learning from over the last few years, and others, like yourself, Mike, others across the country. You're incredibly knowledgeable, right? And it's something like Danya was saying earlier, that there's this almost symbiotic relationship between nonprofit leaders and government in order to create good policy. But that also needs to be coupled with really strong government relationships to shape effective policies. And that's where, people like Maggie, like Danya and myself come in. We have those relationships and we can help the nonprofit leaders navigate things so that we can, build the housing that Canada needs.
I think it's quite surprising. Thank you all for that. I think sometimes for a lot of nonprofits, they're like, hey, we have this great idea. I don't see any funding available for us, so we shelve it. But working with government people in government relations who have that knowledge to say, no, you didn't say it here, but it actually exists over here. Or let's talk to these representatives and see what potentially is coming up, or what's, so not to just shelve it. I think it happens so many times, ideas get shelved. Oh, well, the funding call isn't for this time, or they're waiting for that call. They don't realize too that there's a lot of you have to do a bit of the dance before too, right? The marketing of you, so you are kind of that nonprofit of choice who they're going to go to and say, oh no, I know these guys, they do good work, I've heard about it, I'm familiar, and they push that forward. Right now, critical time. Federally, we're looking at changes coming in the next year. Provincially, in Ontario, we may see upcoming election. There's elections all over the country provincially. So lots of change happening. What are you seeing currently that you think the sector needs to pay attention to with government and housing? Jake, this time we'll start with you, then go with Maggie and with Danya.
No, that's a great question. And I think there are so many ways that we could potentially cut into this. Where I want to go is like what you were saying, Mike, with the change in government federally. What does that really mean for the housing space? So first, before I delve into that, I will bring up like one little anecdote. When I was in grad school, I had this professor who would always go on and on and on and say, fail to plan, plan to fail. And the same idea holds true for effective advocacy, and particularly with the big shift that we're looking at federally. So what I'm trying to say is we need to be proactive and plan ahead in order to succeed amid big shifts that we're going to be seeing. So with that change in government that we're expecting, the incumbent federal government led by Prime Minister Trudeau has been tanking in public opinion polls for years now. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody that's listening to this podcast. Essentially, people really want change right now. And if you were to look at public opinion polls, you would see that a lot of voters see the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, as the viable driver of that change. So it's basically a certainty at this point that he's going to be Prime Minister. It's just a matter of what time in 2025 that's going to happen. I would also say that that will, like I was saying earlier, that will come with a big shift in terms of the way that housing policy is created, policy in general, actually. But that means we need to be prepared, and that also includes a possibility that the national housing strategy, with funding that our sector has come to depend on a lot, might not get any new funding. So we need to think about what that means, and we need to be cognizant of the direction that Poilievre wants to take federal housing policies and programs in, so that we can be proactive and adapt. So there are a couple examples that I would share that are top of mind for me in terms of thinking about that as it relates to affordable housing. So one being Poilievre is really going to focus on homeownership. Like that, I don't think that will surprise anybody, but he will do so in more fulsomely than we've seen with the current federal government. He sees it as he's going to focus on it in a way where any other type of housing is just a step on the path towards ownership, which of course isn't viable for everybody in the country. So the affordable housing sector needs to adapt by integrating affordable housing into the broader conversation on housing affordability. And the question that I would leave open-ended to everybody on that is, how does affordable housing help people realize the dream of homeownership, right? Like, how can you integrate into that sort of idea? Another thing that I would say is we have to think about affordable housing in purely economic terms. So in my experience in the affordable housing sector, we typically gravitate towards making a social or moral argument for, investing in affordable housing, but that's not something that's really going to appeal to a conservative government as much. So you need to really focus on the economic argument for investment. And then the third thing that I will say, and then I'm going to stop talking and pass this on because I know I'm kind of rhapsodizing a little bit here. We know that conservatives, and Poilievre included, want to make government as small as possible. So that means decentralizing key policy areas like housing to the provinces and territories as much as possible, or even getting non-government organizations to deliver on key programs. So if I were to read the writing on the wall, that means that CMHC is going to have a lot less to do with housing programs when Pierre is Prime Minister. And it also means that the sector's provincial advocacy is going to have to increase because resources are going to end up being delivered more provincially or territorially or locally than they currently are.
Thanks, that was great. I appreciate the rant of information. But I'm going to take it a little bit of a different direction because I think you covered that super well. And in terms of what our sector needs to pay attention to, I'm thinking of two key risks almost. The first risk is the way that homelessness gets talked about in elections. I'm really worried about people experiencing homelessness becoming wedge issues rather than the housing crisis. So we have a responsibility, I think, as a housing sector to keep all governments and parties that are running focused on the housing crisis and not allowing the narrative around othering, the polarization, that kind of narrative around people experiencing homelessness become wedge issues in elections. And I think that we're definitely seeing that happen. I think we're seeing that build up towards that in Ontario right now that I'm worried about going into a potential winter election there. And I want to make sure that that doesn't become the wedge issue in the next federal election. Particularly, I want housing to be the top issue that we talk about in the next federal election, but I don't want people experiencing homelessness to become that wedge issue that people are debating rather than the systemic issues that have gotten us into this situation. But then the second piece that I think we should all be thinking about in the housing space going into the next elections is, will these issues fall off of people's minds? Especially as we're now talking about tariffs, we're seeing we saw press conferences around immigration and borders and those types of things. Will Canadians care more about people who can respond to those challenges more than the housing crisis? So I think as a housing sector, we all need to be thinking about how we keep the housing crisis top of mind for Canadians in the next elections, especially as I think now more than we were over the past couple of years, we're broadening what Canadians are thinking about, especially all parties are doing a good job of having those other issues top of their political agendas right now. So keeping our issues top of mind is top of mind for me going into the next little while.
Thanks, Maggie and Jacob. There's a lot to unpack in those pieces, and I definitely want to talk more about those off camera, just in the interest of time. I knew I was going third in this section, and so I went in an even more completely different directions because I went more on the ground level. So because housing is a top priority for Canadians, and governments know that, that means that that's one area where that housing is one area where dollars are actually flowing, and regulations and legislation and policy are constantly being considered. And at the same time, there is an increasing need, obviously, for frontline social services as the affordability crisis continues to get worse and population continues to grow. And the organizations that are providing that front line often don't have the physical footprint to provide the level and amount of services required. And if nonprofits want government support for capital development to help them deliver services, the obvious area is actually housing dollars. So what we're seeing is more frontline service providers actively considering adding housing to their portfolio of work. Generally, that's in partnership with a nonprofit housing provider. And this will absolutely help to bring wraparound supports and healthcare closer to those who need housing. But as nonprofits contemplate this, this has to be done in a very thoughtful way to ensure a continued commitment to their mission and to ensure sustainability. And it's going to be critical as nonprofits develop these partnerships, like frontline service providers developing these partnerships with housing providers. It's got to be done in a way, like I said, that's sustainable for all organizations involved, and in a way where they can articulate the value to governments in order to secure that capital development funding. And that isn't just government relations, but there's a management consulting business design element to this that nonprofits who are considering this should probably undertake in order to make sure that their organization is fit for purpose if they're going to expand that portfolio of work to include critical housing.
Excellent. Thank you all for that. Different angles. Appreciate it. Let's talk about, you've all done excellent work and I think had some major wins, but I want you to focus on one of those major wins. And because you went third last time, Danya, we're going to start with you. You get to go first. Talk about a win that you're really proud of, and then we'll go to Maggie and finish with Jake.
Perfect. Thanks. So there are big front page wins, and then there are like foundational wins that help organizations bring forward change within the sector. And I get really excited by that second bucket because you're putting in place, hopefully, building blocks and changing decision-making patterns that will ideally last beyond the life cycle of individual governments. So earlier this year, the team at Reaching Home, published revised directives and a new glossary of terms in order to guide the federal government's investment in addressing homelessness after a series of consultations within the sector. And critically, when the government published these documents, they named youth as a key subpopulation in many instances and used youth serving initiatives as examples of eligible activities and expenses. And that is critical for permission giving with community entities. It shows them a path where they can focus their Reaching Home investments on youth, where previously there had been little direction. And I was really proud to work with Away Home Canada, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and their national learning community and the Making the Shift Social Innovation Lab to shape input and advocate for these critical youth-focused changes in the Reaching Home documents, with both political staff and civil servants. And, hoping that these changes will unlock investment for youth-specific, preventative interventions in more communities across the country and change investment patterns for community entities so that if there is a change in government federally or if there are adjustments provincially and territorially or even municipally to policy and programs, that it can continue on the path of recognizing that there are subpopulations that require a differentiated way to address homelessness in order to prevent that path towards chronic homelessness.
I like the way you framed that in terms of like the front page wins versus the wins behind the scenes that I think make a big difference. And I think that's actually what's really interesting in the housing space is that a lot of these big changes can actually be really small changes that the government can make. So I joined CAH in March, but before I was here, I was doing government relations in the housing adjacent space. I worked for Universities Canada, which is the association representing universities, and I had the housing file, which got me into this space. But I think a couple of years ago, we saw student housing become a bigger issue in communities across the country because students were struggling to pay their rent, and there was a question around universities and housing students. And universities typically weren't in the business of providing large-scale housing, except for a few of them who do that. So we were saying, if we want universities to be a part of the solution, let's make it possible for them to do that, because they were actually excluded from a lot of programs. And so it was about making small changes to programs that made a big difference for universities. So in September of last year, we saw the GST removed from, I think it was new purpose-built rentals, but universities were excluded from that. So I worked alongside my team with the government to get universities eligible for that exemption. And that makes a big difference in universities being able to build new residences for their students and relieve pressure from the market. And then also the eligibility for the apartment construction loan program. And so those small changes can make a big difference. And I don't think I can claim any of the wins in the housing space from CAH yet, because a lot of that happened before I joined, but there's some really, really amazing work that's happening from the housing sector.
Mhm. But Maggie, you're an all-star, and a lot of the wins that are going to come from CAH are going to be because you're fantastic. So really, really great hearing about the wins that both of you have had. For me, I'm going to cheat a little bit. The time that I had working at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association was just like a really special era of my career so far, because it was a huge opportunity to play a role in helping people across the country get into homes that they need, that they can afford. And so in the last like year and a half or 2 years ish, I can't remember like the specific timing, there was a lot of movement in terms of federal investment in affordable housing to create new units. And that's something that I was really proud to be a part of. So in that span, we were able to get about $8.5 billion of investment and to play a key role in ensuring that happened. And that included, both things like the Affordable Housing Fund, like additional investments in that, but it also included playing a supporting role in, helping different Indigenous housing leaders get the $4 billion for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing as well. And so that was just something that was really special for me, being a part of those things. And then, that was also part of why I decided to do what I'm doing now, and leaving CHRA to start my own company and continuing to support organizations that are, doing important work in the housing space, like Blue Door and, others that we've had the pleasure of working with.
Yeah, I mean, you all do incredible work, and it's not like, for people to understand, it's not a phone call and things happen. I mean, it's meeting after canceled meeting. And as I find it quite often too, I mean, the first response from many politicians is, have you talked to someone else, right? They want to push it on to someone else to see when, and you go around. And so people understand the work in government relations. It's not one and done. It's not we're going to go make a visit and we're good. Like, it's ongoing. And even, I mean, as we just talked, we've got multiple elections coming up. Relationships that you've built now change, and you have to develop new ones, or you're developing those ones while you're still ahead, seeing the future that things are going to change. You start to develop relationships with new individuals, opposition parties, etc. So it is tough work, and the wins that you just talked about did not come without a heck of a lot of time and effort behind them. So thank you. If people want to find out more about the work you're doing, or perhaps engage you in doing more work, where can they go? Maggie, we'll start with you, then go to Danya, and end with Jake.
The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness on our website or socials, CAH. And our current campaign we're running in Ontario is homesnothandcuffs.ca, or just Google that. It'll be the first one that comes up.
Very cool.
Connect with me on LinkedIn. I mean, my name is written out here. I'm always happy to chat. I love small talk and big policy and political talk, but I really do love small talk. Or go on the website, strategycorp.com, and you can find my email there.
Awesome. And but like Danya said, connect with me on LinkedIn as well. My name is written there. There's only one Jacob Gorenkoff in the world, so I'm pretty easy to find. And then also check out our website. It's homewardpa.ca.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I've had the privilege of seeing all of your work. Danya with Away Home Canada, Maggie with CAEH as well. They've done some great campaigns. I love this new campaign too. And Jacob working directly with Blue Door. I've been able to see that, and with your work at CHRA in the past. And the value that's behind it. So folks, these are three amazing examples of people who have had great impact in the sector and will continue to do so. And I hope that, if anyone gets anything out of it today, it's that the importance of building those relationships with the professionals that can help you have the highest level of impact. Jacob, Maggie, Danya, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.